In a region of southern China that had barely produced a single significant earthquake in over 3 centuries, the ground suddenly ruptured twice in less than a single day. Two powerful earthquakes, both measuring magnitude 5.2, struck within hours of each other near the city of Liuzhou, killing residents, collapsing homes, triggering landslides, and shaking buildings as far away as Hong Kong and the capital of Vietnam. Scientists studying the region are calling it one of the strangest and most unexpected seismic events China has recorded in decades, not because of the size of the earthquakes, but because of where they happened, and what they suggest is now possible in places long assumed to be safe. Today we're breaking down exactly what happened in Liuzhou, why researchers are so surprised by it, and what this event is quietly telling scientists about hidden earthquake risk in places nobody was watching closely. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Before we get into it, drop a comment below. Have you ever felt an earthquake that came out of nowhere, somewhere you never expected the ground to move? Tell me where you were and what it felt like. And if you want to be the first to know every time something significant happens geologically anywhere on this planet, subscribe to the Soccer Clock right now. It's completely free, and a thumbs up helps enormously. If we can get this video to 5,000 likes, the algorithm will actually put it in front of the people who need to see it. Thank you. Now, let's get into it. The first earthquake struck just after midnight local time, a magnitude 5.0 to 5.2 event centered in Liujiang district, on the outskirts of Liuzhou, a city of well over 1 million people in China's Guangxi region. Less than a day later, in the early evening, a second earthquake hit, this one measuring magnitude 5.1 to 5.2 depending on which monitoring agency's data you look at, centered barely 2 kilometers away from the first. Chinese seismic authorities eventually confirmed both events at magnitude 5.2, two separate, powerful earthquakes in nearly the exact same location within a single day of each other. This kind of event has a specific name in seismology. It's called a doublet earthquake. Two similarly sized quakes striking close together in time and location, rather than one large main shock followed by a tail of smaller aftershocks. Doublets are relatively unusual on their own, but what makes this particular sequence even stranger is the seismic history of the region where it happened. According to China's Earthquake Network Center, only one earthquake of magnitude 5.0 or greater had been recorded within 100 kilometers of this exact spot going back to the year 1900. In other words, this is a part of the country that had gone well over a century without producing an earthquake anywhere near this size. Chinese seismologists have described this event as the strongest to hit the area in 331 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Not the strongest in a decade, not the strongest since modern seismic recording began, the strongest in 331 years. That is the kind of statement that immediately gets the attention of every earthquake scientist studying fault behavior in China, because it means this fault system, whatever exactly triggered it, had been sitting essentially dormant for longer than most countries have existed in their current form, and then it suddenly produced two powerful ruptures within hours of each other. The human impact on the ground was immediate and serious. A married couple was killed when their house collapsed during the first earthquake, and at least 5 other people were injured. Local authorities activated a Level 3 emergency response, mobilizing rescue teams into the district within hours. One especially dramatic moment from the rescue effort involved a 91-year-old man who was initially reported missing after his building collapsed, feared to be one more casualty of the disaster. Rescue crews continued searching through the rubble, and remarkably, he was found alive and pulled out of the wreckage, one of the few genuinely hopeful moments to emerge from an otherwise devastating event. At least 16 homes were completely destroyed, and nearly 1,000 additional structures across the district were severely damaged: cracked walls, collapsed roofs, buildings rendered unsafe to enter. Over 7,000 people were displaced from their homes after the first earthquake alone, forced into emergency shelters while officials assessed which structures were still safe to live in. The earthquakes also triggered secondary geological hazards on top of the direct structural damage. Sinkholes opened up in parts of the district, and a landslide blocked a major road, complicating both the rescue effort and the delivery of emergency supplies to affected communities. Then came the second earthquake that evening, striking an already shaken, already displaced population. This one injured at least one additional person, caused another house to collapse, damaged several more structures, and triggered additional rockfalls in the surrounding hills. For residents who had already fled their homes once that day, many of them exhausted, frightened, and unsure whether it was safe to return, a second major earthquake within hours delivered exactly the kind of psychological and physical blow that makes disaster response in these situations so difficult. You are not just rescuing people from one event. You are managing an already traumatized population through a second one before the first has even been fully addressed. In the days that followed, seismic monitoring stations across the region recorded an extensive aftershock sequence, with more than 59 individual aftershocks detected within just a few days of the initial doublet. That kind of sustained aftershock activity is fairly typical following a significant earthquake, the surrounding rock adjusting to the stress redistributed by the two main shocks, but it meant that residents in Liuzhou were dealing with continued ground shaking for an extended period after the initial disaster, on top of already damaged and weakened buildings. The shaking itself was felt across a surprisingly wide area. Tremors from the earthquakes were reported not just throughout Guangxi's major cities, including Guilin, Nanning, and Wuzhou, but as far away as Hong Kong, hundreds of kilometers to the southeast. Even more remarkably, the shaking was felt across the border in northern Vietnam, including in the capital city of Hanoi. When an earthquake of this magnitude is felt clearly in a foreign capital hundreds of kilometers from its epicenter, it tells seismologists something important about how efficiently the local geology transmits seismic energy, and it's part of why this event has drawn so much scientific attention, despite not being an especially large earthquake by global standards. Here is where the scientific mystery genuinely deepens. When Chinese seismologists began investigating what caused these earthquakes, their initial analysis pointed to reverse faulting, meaning one block of crust was thrust up and over an adjacent block, along a fault system near the Heqi-Yizhou Liucheng fault zone. But here's the critical detail. Researchers studying that specific fault system had previously estimated its maximum potential earthquake magnitude at around 5.5, based on its historically weak and infrequent seismic activity. This was not a fault system anyone had flagged as capable of producing repeated, significant, damaging earthquakes. It was, by all prior assessments, one of the quieter, lower-risk fault zones in the region. Separately, provincial earthquake officials cited by state media pointed instead to movement along the nearby Baipeng Fault, just a few kilometers from the epicenter, adding another layer of complexity to understanding exactly which fault structure is responsible. And in a detail that has drawn particular interest from geologists, some Chinese seismic officials noted that underground karst cave systems in the region, essentially networks of caverns and voids formed by dissolving limestone bedrock over thousands of years, may have played a role in amplifying the ground shaking experienced at the surface. Guangxi is famous globally for its karst landscape, the dramatic limestone hills and cave networks that make the region a major tourist destination. But that same karst geology, riddled with underground voids, can behave very differently under seismic stress than solid, uniform bedrock, potentially amplifying shaking in ways that are difficult to predict using standard models built for more typical geological settings. Experts examining the sequence have also debated exactly how to classify it. Some initially treated it as a straightforward aftershock sequence following a single main shock, but because both major earthquakes occurred within the same day, at nearly identical magnitude, researchers have since suggested a more precise classification, describing it as a doublet earthquake swarm that was preceded by a series of smaller foreshocks the day before. Those foreshocks, several small tremors that struck the area the previous day, actually served an unintentional protective purpose. Residents who felt those early tremors became noticeably more cautious and alert in the hours before the larger earthquake struck, and that heightened awareness is credited with helping people react more quickly and safely when the major shaking began. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of knowing exactly when and where a major quake will strike, remains beyond current scientific capability anywhere in the world. But foreshock sequences, when they occur, are one of the few natural early warning signs available, even though scientists can never be certain in the moment whether a small tremor is a foreshock to something bigger or simply an isolated minor event on its own. In this case, retrospectively, the smaller tremors the day before genuinely were a warning sign, and the fact that residents responded to that warning by staying alert likely helped limit the human toll of what followed. So why does an earthquake sequence like this matter beyond the immediate disaster it caused? It matters because of what it reveals about seismic hazard assessment more broadly. Earthquake risk maps and hazard models are built using historical data, decades or centuries of recorded seismic activity used to estimate how likely a damaging earthquake is in any given region and how large that earthquake might realistically get. A fault system with 331 years of relative quiet, previously assessed as only capable of producing earthquakes up to around magnitude 5.5, just produced two separate ruptures at 5.2 within hours of each other. That is a fault system performing very close to, if not right at, the upper edge of what scientists believed it was even capable of, in a region that had shown almost no significant seismic activity in the historical record. This raises an uncomfortable but scientifically important question that seismologists in China and elsewhere are now grappling with. If a fault system that appeared quiet and low risk for over 3 centuries can suddenly produce a damaging doublet earthquake, how many other fault systems around the world, currently classified as low risk based on limited historical data, might be capable of similar surprises? Earthquake science is fundamentally limited by the length of the historical record available for any given fault. A fault that has been quiet for the roughly 125 years of modern seismic record-keeping in a given country isn't necessarily a safe fault. It may simply be a fault whose full behavior hasn't been observed yet, because the recording period available to scientists is a tiny fraction of the geological timescales over which these systems actually accumulate and release stress. It's worth explaining briefly why doublet earthquakes happen at all, since they behave differently than a typical single main shock followed by aftershocks. In a standard sequence, one large rupture releases the majority of accumulated stress along a fault, and the aftershocks that follow are progressively smaller adjustments to that stress redistribution. In a doublet, two fault segments of roughly similar size and stress level rupture in close succession, essentially two separate but closely linked earthquakes rather than one large event and its aftermath. This can happen when the first rupture transfers enough additional stress onto a neighboring fault segment to push it past its own breaking point within a very short window of time, hours in this case, rather than the days, months, or years such stress transfer might normally take to trigger a subsequent rupture. For the people of Liuzhou, the scientific classification matters less than the practical reality they're now living through. Families are staying in temporary shelters, while engineers assess which of the nearly 1,000 damaged buildings can be safely repaired, and which need to be demolished entirely. Rescue and recovery teams have continued responding to reports of structural damage and secondary hazards like the sinkholes and landslides triggered by the shaking. And with dozens of aftershocks continuing to strike the district in the days following the two main shocks, residents have had little opportunity to feel fully settled, even as emergency services work to restore normal life to the area. There's also a broader lesson in how quickly Chinese emergency response systems mobilized once the first earthquake struck. Within hours, a Level 3 emergency response was activated, rescue crews were deployed, and search efforts began in earnest, efforts that ultimately located and saved the 91-year-old survivor pulled from the rubble of his collapsed home. That kind of rapid institutional response, even in a region that had no recent history of significant seismic activity and therefore no deeply established local disaster protocols specific to earthquakes, made a measurable difference in outcomes. It is a reminder that disaster preparedness isn't only valuable in regions with obvious, well-known seismic risk. It's valuable everywhere, precisely because events like this one demonstrate that damaging earthquakes can occur in places with little recent history of them at all. Scientists studying the Liuzhou sequence will likely spend months, if not years, refining their understanding of exactly which fault or combination of faults produced these earthquakes, how the region's unique karst limestone geology influenced the shaking residents actually experienced, and what this event means for how seismic hazard is assessed in similarly quiet regions elsewhere in China and around the world. What is already clear is that this was not a routine seismic event, a doublet earthquake, striking a fault system assessed as low risk, in a region that had gone over 3 centuries without a comparable quake, killing residents, displacing thousands, and being felt as far away as a neighboring country's capital city. That combination of factors is exactly why seismologists are treating Liuzhou not as an isolated, forgettable local disaster, but as a genuinely important data point in the much larger, ongoing effort to understand where the next unexpected earthquake might strike. We'll keep tracking this story as researchers continue to study exactly what happened beneath Liuzhou and what it might mean for earthquake risk assessment more broadly. Subscribe to the Soccer Clock so you don't miss it, and drop a comment below. Have you ever experienced an earthquake in a place that wasn't supposed to have them? Tell me your story. Let's get this video to 5,000 likes. See you in the next one.